welcome back to Look Up on the Screen, a retrospective of Superman in cinema. Last time I introduced this series and told you what I hope to accomplish with it. This time, we're going to take a look at the first cinematic appearance of the Man of Steel. No, we've got a long way to go before we get there, and even then it's not going to be what you think it is. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. The first cinematic appearance of Superman was a series of animated shorts commissioned by Paramount Pictures to be produced by underappreciated in their time animators Max and Dave Fleischer. Fleischer Studios have been gradually making a name for themselves since the late 1920s, but never really became a household name, largely thanks to another studios run by a man who is much better at marketing himself and his products. The Fleischers managed to create several innovations in animations, including the perfection of rotoscoping as an animation technique, the now cliché follow the bouncing ball sing-along, and yes, despite what popular belief in the Walt Disney Company would have you believe, the successful syncing of sound to cartoons for a full 4 years before Steamboat Willie. Although, admittedly, my old Kentucky home is also racist as hell, so that may have contributed to its lack of credit for the achievement. Despite the productions being gorgeously animated and very creative, Fleischer Studios never really hit it big with the public in the same way that Disney and later Warner Brothers would. In fact, their most famous creations are the in-house character of Betty Boop and their adaptation of King Feature's syndicate character Popeye the Sailor. However, the implementation of the Hays Code in 1934 necessitated some softening of Betty over the years, to the point that the Fleischers started focusing more and more on Popeye, with Betty getting less and less attention until her series of cartoons was ultimately canceled in 1939. Meanwhile, Paramount Pictures had managed to pick up the option to bring Superman to film after Republic Pictures, who were trying to do a live-action Superman serial, let their option expire when they couldn't figure out how to make a live-action Superman fly. Paramount decided to take a different tact. By doing an animated Superman, they could avoid the cost of costly special effects work and wouldn't risk injuring an actor on set. Paramount contacted Fleischer Studios and pitched the idea directly to Max Fleischer. There was one small problem. Max didn't want to do it. To this point, Fleischer Studios productions had relied on more cartoonish anatomy for their productions. The Popeye characters were already hideously distorted thanks to comic artist E.C. Seeger's designs, and even Betty Boop had started off as an anthropomorphic dog before being altered into the form we know today. Superman, however, was going to require much more realistic anatomy than the Fleischers were comfortable with. Their only real project with this kind of character design had been their 1939 feature Gulliver's Travels, which even then features very few characters that weren't cartoonish in design. While Gulliver's Travels had been a success, Max Fleischer was disappointed that it hadn't been a bigger success. And as such, when given the Superman opportunity, he politely declined by citing a budget of $100,000 per short. Much to his surprise, Paramount agreed. The influx of cash allowed Fleischer Studios to do some things they hadn't been able to before, things like pencil tests, which were kind of a luxury back in the day. And, in addition, Max's brother and partner, Dave Fleischer, designed the new look of the series, creating backgrounds and character designs and all that stuff. And, to put the icing on the cake, actors Bud Collyer and Joan Alexander were called up from the Superman radio series to revive their performances as Superman and Lois Lane. In September of 1941, the first short, simply titled Superman, and in subsequent years given the unofficial title of The Mad Scientist to distinguish it from the series as a whole, made its debut and made it quite clear that the Fleischers had wisely invested the money from Paramount into the production. This short is gorgeous. The animation is fluid and action-packed. The backgrounds are an Art Deco wonderland. The short has very little dialogue and is almost completely all action. And there's even a little old-school Fleischer flair in the form of the Mad Scientist's pet parrot. Mad Scientist would continue to be a recurring nemesis for Superman in these first 9 shorts. However, while the Mad Scientist scene in the first short is quite clearly villainous and evil, that's not always the case for the others that appeared. The magnetic telescope also features a mad scientist, but in this case the scientist is more blinded by proving his invention, a telescope that can magnetically draw comets and other astronomical bodies to Earth, works as intended rather than threatening the populace with it. However, there is an interesting twist on the mad scientist villain in the electric earthquake.
And I still say Manhattan rightfully belongs to my people.
Possibly, but just what do you expect us to do about it?
You have a newspaper. Publish the truth. Have the island vacated immediately.
It's fantastic.
Why, that's ridiculous.
Ridiculous? Maybe modern science will make you think differently.
Yeah, this scientist is Native American and wants to take Manhattan back for his people. And really, interestingly, he's not really portrayed as stereotypically as Native Americans usually were in animation from this era and beyond.
Now you know why the red man's red.
He's calm, soft-spoken, and deadly serious in his intentions. Even when he inevitably captures Lois Lane, and Lois gets captured a ridiculous amount in this series, he doesn't really seem to regard her as anything more than a nuisance, where other villains in the series love to use her as a victim or literal captive audience. It's just kind of jarring knowing what we know about race relations at that time compared to what we see on screen. Whether it was battling an army of remote-controlled robots in the Mechanical Monsters, a gang of masked bandits with a souped-up armored car in Billion Dollar Limited, or another gang of bandits with a flying missile car in the Bulleteers, sci-fi ruled the day in the early Superman shorts. Hell, Superman even fought a giant dinosaur nearly 12 years before Godzilla would hit Japanese movie screens. He even followed this up by fighting a rampaging gorilla in another short and taking on the forces of nature in the form of an erupting volcano on a tropical island. What helps sell these largely supervillainless plots is the fact that Fleischer's Superman is quite clearly nowhere near the godlike level of power that we would see in later years in the comics and other Superman productions. Superman exerts himself in these shorts. He strains, he struggles, he gets taken by surprise. He gets hurt even if he isn't injured, and it makes us believe in him and what he can do all the more. It shows that what he does may be possible for him to do, but by no means is it easy for him. This is a far cry from the effortless way Superman could, say, pick up the entire Daily Planet building and tote it around to tease Perry White in later Silver Age comics. These shorts had a lot of impact on the perception of Superman by the public. So much so that there's one particular Superman trope that got started because of two of these shorts.
This looks like a job for Superman.
Yeah, that trope got started right here. And if you're wondering how it got so widespread in the public consciousness, well, the answer to that kind of lies in the same reasons why these first 9 Superman shorts were the last real success the Fleischers ever had. In the late 30s, Max and Dave Fleischer decided to move their entire studio from New York to Miami. They claimed it was so the studio could grow and flourish, but this explanation is kind of suspect as at that time, Miami had no motion picture post-production facilities, so anything the Fleischers produced had to be shipped back to New York, or in the case of the Superman shorts, shipped to Technicolor in Hollywood for processing. Not only that, Max and Dave Fleischer both had summer homes there, so make of that what you will. In any event, Paramount had loaned the Fleischers $100,000 to finance the move, but in late 1941, Paramount just suddenly decided to call in the loan in full immediately. This was in addition to Max and Dave Fleischer growing distant and apart from each other to the point that they were only communicating via interoffice memos at that point. Not only that, rumor had it that Dave, a habitual gambler, had an actual bookie on call to the office to make bets. Funds were being gambled away or risked on the stock market. Because of all this turmoil, the Fleischers weren't able to repay the loan when Paramount came calling. Under the terms of the loan, if they couldn't pay, the studio and all its physical and visual property would become property of Paramount. However, Paramount's sudden demand for payment in full was illegal. In the loan agreement, the Fleischers were given 10 years to repay the debt. However, when Max was called to New York to meet with Paramount executives, the Miami offices were mysteriously burglarized, and it just so happened that the agreement with Paramount went missing as a result. Dave Fleischer would later claim Paramount goons took him out on a boat and threatened him unless he gave up his stake in the studio. Whatever the reason, when the papers were presented to him, they were signed and returned to Max within 5 minutes. To make a long story short, Paramount took the studios, reformed them into Famous Studios, ousted Max and Dave, and rehired most of their animators under the Famous Studios banner. Also under the Famous Studios banner, 8 more Superman shorts were produced. And with the country firmly ensconced in World War II at that time, well...
Stop where you are. Leave plane immediately, or girl will be released.
Okay, little man, you win.
Yeah. In addition to that, the remaining 7 Superman shorts from the famous studio era are nowhere near as good as the first 9. Most of the science fiction tropes are gone, half of them are essentially pro-American propaganda for the war effort. Hell, one installment starts with Clark Kent and Lois Lane as prisoners in Japan, where Superman goes out and sabotages the military during his alleged capture. Quality-wise, they're okay. The animation is still pretty good, and there's one really entertaining pulpy installment involving a tribe of bird people living at the alleged center of the Earth. Oh, just a second. Hey, when did Hawkman debut? Huh. Anyway, yeah, the remaining 9 shorts aren't as good as the first, but still worth a watch. What's more interesting is where things went from here. What a lot of people don't realize is that if World War II hadn't happened, we'd have gotten television a lot sooner than we did. The first TVs were rolling off the assembly lines before Pearl Harbor happened, and as such, Paramount had realized that a lot of their products could be resold for almost 100% profit to various television concerns. And by ousting the Fleischers, they could then sell that library, which by 1955 was 661 animated projects and wouldn't have to pay the brothers a single dime. Alright, one last little backtrack before we move on. The final Superman short, Secret Agent, was premiered in 1943, and now with Famous Studios firmly under Paramount's control, they apparently decided that was enough Superman for anybody, and then began focusing Famous's work on making more Popeye cartoons. Now, they still kept hold of the shorts and sold them along with the other Fleischer and Famous productions in the aforementioned 1955 TV deal. However, this is where things get a little confusing, because these 17 shorts nowadays are in the public domain. But wait, I hear you ask, if these shorts are in the public domain, then that means Superman's in the public domain, right? Isn't that what that whole mess over Mickey Mouse back in the 90s was all about? Well, yes, and no. You see, while the 17 shorts featuring Superman produced by Fleischer and Famous Studios are in the public domain, Superman the character was still copyrighted by then National Periodicals, and these days is not only copyright DC Comics, but also trademarked, which is another kettle of fish altogether. Because copyright law has evolved like crazy over the years. This is really long and complicated, like anything having to do with copyright, but essentially, prior to the U.S. Copyright Act of 1976, any work entered the public domain after 28 years of existence with the option to extend it for another 28 years. Disney naturally filed that protection in 1956 for Steamboat Willie, thus protecting it until 1984. Well, then the 1976 Copyright Act changed the length of copyright to the life of the creator plus 50 years after their death, with works for hire, i.e. works created for a corporate purpose, having a flat 75-year period protecting those works that had renewed their copyright under the old system. But there are literally hundreds of films where the rights holders didn't file for that renewal before January 1st, 1978, when the new provisions went into effect. When Paramount sold the Superman shorts to television, the responsibility for renewing the copyright on those shorts fell on the new owners, who failed to renew the copyright. As such, the Superman shorts have been in the public domain starting in 1969 and continued to fall into the public domain until 1971, when the copyright expired on the last few Famous Studios shorts. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of copyright law because it is a thorny mess and I am not an attorney. But essentially, in 1992, the law was changed so that the onus on renewing copyright on the rights holder was removed from law, making copyright one solid, unbroken time. In 1998, it was extended to the life of the author plus 70 years. Or, in the case of corporate-made works, which would be most movies, TV shows, and what have you, it is a flat 120 years since the date of creation, or 95 years since publication for printed works, whichever comes first. Since the Walt Disney Company lobbied heavily for these extensions, it became known in the media as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. Now remember, under the 1976 Copyright Act, Steamboat Willie was protected until 2003. With the new extension, that extended the protection until 2024, which is when Steamboat Willie is supposed to phase into the public domain. So, if that's all well and good, but again, what does this have to do with DC Comics being able to claim copyright and trademark on Superman, and these 17 shorts still somehow being in the public domain? Well, for starters, each of the Fleischer and Famous Studios shorts are considered individual works for hire. Paramount acquired the film rights from National Periodicals, subcontracted the Fleischers to produce them, then took full control when they ousted them later and resold them. DC Comics had no real claim on the shorts because Paramount had already paid them for the rights to use the Superman characters. DC, however, still held the publication rights on Superman comics and later registered Superman as a trademark. Trademarks exist in perpetuity as long as a company is actively using them. So yes, DC can claim Superman is copyrighted and trademarked, while those 17 shorts, thanks to Paramount's buyer failing to renew the copyright, are in the public domain, thus allowing anyone to distribute, broadcast, fold, spindle, or mutilate as they see fit. But they can only do that with those 17 cartoons. No one can claim ownership of the Superman character other than DC Comics and its parent companies, because the rest of the rights to the character are firmly in the hands of Time Warner, who through one subsidiary or another continues to produce Superman media. In fact, Warner Brothers even found a way around the public domain aspect of the Fleischer shorts by locating the original master tapes for television broadcast and buying them outright. So while anyone can market the Superman shorts, and many small home video companies have, if you want the highest quality possible, you're going to have to go for the version released on DVD by Warner Brothers. So there you have it, a brief history of Superman's first cinematic appearance, and also a brief and extremely simplified lesson in copyright law. But that was not the end. In fact, this was only the beginning of Superman's cinematic adventures. 5 years after the last short left theaters, Columbia Pictures succeeded where Republic failed. And that's what we're going to look at next time, as the world got its first glimpse of the live-action Man of Steel in the 1948 serialized adventures of Superman. I'm Aaron Mills, reminding you to look up on the screen.